Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome again to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for watching, and thanks to our producer, Jeff Durall. We're in the Kansas room of the Hayes Public Library on Main Street with the retired Kansas room librarian, Marianne Thompson. Does that still sound strange? Retired?
A little bit, yeah.
After all, the premier Kansas room librarian for what, since 1985 about?
It was, yeah, 85.
And retired just recently after 28 years.
Right out, yeah.
And obviously, being in the Kansas room, a very extensive interest and education in history, Marianne.
Well, and I do have a background in history, not so much Kansas history, but I grew up in Wyoming, and a lot of Western Kansas history is the same as, same characters were both places, the railroad, everything. So it didn't take long to get right into the Kansas local history aspects of things here. But I do have a couple of degrees in history as well as the library degree, so it's not totally foreign to me.
A little bit later on we'll be talking about Marianne Thompson's book, Hayes in the 30s, but I want to find out a little bit about the Kansas room itself, the edition which was begun in 1957 thanks to the patron name on the library, the Dorothy Richards room.
Dorothy Richards was the director of the library. They called him just librarian back then, from like 52, 51, 52. And she was a big Kansas person, and she was born on Kansas Day. We think that's part of the deal. And so she collected Kansas items and kept them behind her desk, and then if you wanted to get a hold of them, well, the Kansas collection got so big that they cleared out like a boiler room or something in the basement of the Carnegie building and painted the walls turquoise and created a Kansas room in 57, which is got to be at least one of the earliest, if not the earliest, in the state.
And one of the largest, too, Marianne.
Well, at this point, we really are.
But in the Kansas room, if you look through the stacks here, which is downstairs in the basement, by the way, and very easily identifiable once you get down to the basement level, it's a lot about Kansas, of course, but a lot about state and general history, isn't it? Well,
in History of the West, I was talking to somebody from the State Historical Society once. They were down here, kind of awing and things, and I said, I don't know how you do Kansas history by ignoring the Civil War or ignoring the history of the West, because we're too involved in both of those aspects. And so that's why the collection does include a lot of Civil War and a lot of history of the West, because I don't think you can just take Kansas out by itself. We're part of the whole issues. Bleeding Kansas for the Civil War, and of course the Indian Wars, and Custer was here, and that group for the western two-thirds of the state.
Yeah, when you look at the history of Hayes and Ellis County and this area particularly, many names jump out at you from legendary nationwide history.
Yeah. Wild Bill Hickok was here. He was an acting sheriff at one point, and he got in a couple of scrapes and a couple of fights and left here, became a U.S. Marshal. Typical, whatever. Custer was here. William Cody, as a very young man, people think of him older, but he was like 20 when he came here and tried to start his own town. Didn't work out too well, so
that was Rome, right?
Rome. And so he got the concession to kill buffalo for the railroad, and he got his nickname from a contest that they held. He lived here, but they went out west. So we're not going to take away from Oakley, but they went out that direction. He shot more buffalo than the other guy, so he claimed the title. The truth is both of them used Buffalo Bill as a title for the rest of their lives. But Buffalo Bill knew how to sell himself. He wrote several books, and he talks about Hayes in most of the early parts of his books. But the history of the railroad coming through here, and we were a railroad town, and we had a fort, and all of that, it coincides with so much other Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, other places in their history, and the Battle of Beecher Island had people from this fort, but it's in Colorado. They traveled that far. And so, yeah, you really just can't separate state lines.
Well, now the Kansas room, and Marianne was the first librarian in the Kansas room.
Actually,
and
Dorothy was the first. She retired as director, became the first Kansas room librarian. And then there were a couple of people in between us that lasted like a year or something. So, yeah, after that it was me.
But you really started, I think, in an area that has become an integral part of the Kansas room, and that's genealogy.
The genealogy.
Thanks to your first efforts.
Basically, that's me, yeah. And it is huge. Now so much is on a computer, but there's still a lot of family histories that have been donated to us, and they're used a lot, or have been in the past. And we do have Ancestry on the computers back here, and Heritage Quest and some other things that help.
But you have actually created a digital database with the computerizing of many of these archives.
Our digital archive is the photographs that we're going to discuss here in a little while, but we have a really nice photograph collection. And then due to some work from a couple of local guys, Bud Dalton and Pete Felton brought me photos of people that they, thought should be in a collection. And then right before I left, we were having a scan day every month, and people would bring their stuff in, and I would scan it and give it to them, but then I would keep copies, and so they're all on the digital archive. And right now, the Convention and Visitors Bureau is using it quite heavily. They're on Facebook. They're throwing up photos, and it says courtesy of the library, so you know that's one of ours. And you can find them down here.
Well, now, you're retired, spending your time doing what now? Reading?
Reading, playing with the dog, getting up when I want to.
But you haven't disconnected from the community as yet.
I live here, and I'm going to live here. And I'm still available for interviews. And
You're still doing presentations.
Yes.
You're on the State Historical
I'm
Society
on the state board.
You still work with Blues and Barbecue on the committee.
I am. And I'm hoping to put together a program for the Kansas Humanities Councils of Speakers.
All right. Now, when Marianne Thompson has some reading time of her own, what does she read?
She reads a lot of mysteries.
Uh-huh.
I just picked up the latest Kathy Reich's book right here. Right now I am reading the history of Catherine the Great by Robert Massey, who just won the very first Carnegie Award given out for nonfiction. And it's fascinating. But it's a very heavy, thick book, so I read mysteries in between.
Well, and even the public library has started a mystery book club, I believe, haven't they?
It's a very popular genre,
Marianne Thompson, the retired director of the Kansas Room at the Hayes Public Library. In just a moment, we'll talk about the book. The book is Hayes, the 30s, and we'll be back in just a moment. You're watching Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Back in a moment.
I've had it. No more of this business. This is the last straw. Dude, you're out of here. You're costing me too much money. You don't work when you're supposed to, and you're cramping my style. It's time you got out of here. Seriously, I'm ditching you. I'm switching to Eagle!
Ditch the dish and get $200. Call Eagle Communications today at 877-61-EAGLE.
Welcome back to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Visiting with the retired librarian of the Kansas Room of the Hayes Public Library on Main, Marianne Thompson. And this is the book, Hayes, the 30s. And before we begin, I want to put in a shameless plug that if you have parents or grandparents who have been longtime residents, who have lived in Hayes, who have still here or moved away, this is your Christmas gift for this coming season. Believe me, with Hayes history in abundance from the 30s, visiting with Marianne Thompson of the Hayes Public Library. Okay, first question, of course, obviously, is why the 30s, Marianne?
Well, most of the photographs we have that were given by the Icky family were the early Icky pictures from the 30s. So most of what I had at the time that were printed and digitized already, so it saved a lot of time, were from the 30s. And one reason why we had so many from the 30s a couple of reasons. Mr. Icky was the photographer for the Reveille, and in those days, the newspapers didn't have their own photographers, so he went out and did commercial photography to sell to newspapers and events and things like that. So that changed later on, so you don't have as many photos. The other thing is the nature of photography is they were nitrate film. Nitrate film combusts after a while. So with the help of Leon Staub down at Pioneer Photography, every year I would take them in and get them printed up to get rid of hazardous negatives. And so that was the brunt of the collection from the 30s.
And thanks to the work of R.E. Icky, that was where much of this has been preserved.
Right.
The work that has been done on this actually was in conjunction with the library's centennial, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was in charge of the centennial celebration, and I tend to plan way ahead. And this company had actually come to me years ago before we had digitized anything, and it would have been very difficult to put together one of these books. But then I remembered them, so I contacted them and gave a proposal, and they accepted it. And then I told them I wanted it as part of our centennial, and so we had a deadline and went to work on it.
And the 30s and the book have been divided into categories, and we'll talk more about those in just a moment. But the work itself took, what, a couple of years?
To do the research, yeah, it took, because I was doing other things here, wasn't like I was doing it full time, and I spent a lot of time on microfilm, checking and rechecking the dates and what was going on in these photos, because as we all know, there's a group of guys that hang out and would scrupulously check to make sure I was right. And I didn't want to blow it. So I spent a lot of time on microfilm, looking up and checking. Icky put dates on his photos, but for the commercial ones, he wasn't all that exact sometimes, and so I would have to check months before or after, but usually he had the year right.
And by the way, we should mention, as Marianne said, he was photographer for the Reveille, which was the Fort Hays State newspaper or
yearbook.
Yearbook, I guess. The work itself divided into categories, opening with the Hays in the 30s and a little history of Hays, and a beautiful picture of the initial Hays Public Library right
Carnegie
there in the
building.
opening part.
That's the only picture that isn't an Icky picture. That's a Pete Felton picture, actually. So it's the only one that isn't an Icky.
And that is the original
Yes.
of the Ellis County or Hays Public Library. When the 30s began, Hays had a population of about 5,000, I think. And then at
like
the
that.
end of the decade, it had increased to 7,000.
Yeah.
You know, one of the striking things, Marianne, the 30s. Now, the first thing that comes to mind to most of us are the dirty 30s, the dust storms, the drought, the heat, those type of things. But the photographs themselves seem to reveal just an average type of existence and environment.
And maybe even more upbeat than you would expect.
Absolutely.
We had a lot of celebrations. The university turned 30, the city turned 70, big, huge celebrations. And part of that, I think, is just the nature of Kansans anyway. Things get bad, we're just going to do what we do anyway. The other aspect is at the end of the 20s, Ellis County had oil being found. Well, so Ellis County, the farming was really in bad shape, but a lot of farmers also had some extra oil activity going on. So probably weren't as bad off economically as some other places. But I think it's just a resilience of Western Kansas people in general to, we're not going to go stop doing what we're doing. They had a huge barbecue for the 70th anniversary and fed 5,000 people down at Frontier Park. And I have photos from that. And the cover is actually the 30th anniversary of the university, and the Vice President of the United States was here. Big events.
Absolutely. Visit by the Vice President is related in the book itself. As we mentioned, it's divided into different segments, arts and entertainment being one of those, and you see everything from the Fort Hays State University, or the Normal College as it originally was called, to the high schools and presentations that are still going on today, like class presentations and things like that.
They used to have May Day events and maypoles, and there was just a lot of activities that went on.
And there was also the picture again of the Hays Public Library, a grant of $8,000 from Andrew Carnegie, opened in July of 1911. Just one of the pictures you'll see. Other pictures that struck me, and part of it was the Hays Boy Scouts, the Mohican Patrol of Troop 59. And then there was the presentation of the campaign. There were politics involved as we got into the People's segment, with the first woman congressman in Kansas, from here in Hays.
Yeah. Catherine O'Laughlin is campaigning in front of her father's automobile agency.
Yeah, the O'Laughlin Motor Company.
The O'Laughlin Motor Company.
And then we move to some of the special events, and that's where you can really tell that even though, as Marianne said, these were desperate times in the 30s, but Hays and Ellis County moved on with events, including a visit by the famous Tom
Mix was here. Evidently, by the pictures, because he's surrounded by women, rather attractive women, that was kind of his group. He
he brought his own group with him, apparently. 70th anniversary of the founding of Hays, celebrated October 20, 1937. As you mentioned, big parade downtown. And then afterward, a huge celebration.
Huge celebration down in the park. The men it's men that are serving the barbecue, and they're all wearing 10-gallon hats. And it's just quite the images.
We couldn't let this go by either without a tribute to the sports in the area.
Well, sports are an event here, still are. But there were so many others, like the leading one there is the boxing club. And there's a young man with boxing gloves that seem bigger than his body is, and then all the way up to, high school age groups.
And there were all kinds of sports, including, of course, Fort Hays State with football and basketball. St. Joseph College then, as its football team was noted. Hays High School represented here as well in sports. Then we move into some of the organizations and groups, and from that we see, for example, some of the buildings that are still in evidence.
Well, and that was, I think, one reason why the company went with my just picking the 30s, because the Chestnut Street District, the historical district downtown, those buildings that are being restored are the buildings in these pictures. And so you can match them up, and it's kind of fun.
It is. It's amazing, the amount of references in here. And of course, the courthouse, the original courthouse, which you have in the entry here. Ellis County had problems with her early courthouses. They seem to burn down with great frequency. The picture is the fourth courthouse, built in 1898 and shown in a picture from 1933.
And that's the one that will get torn down for the one that we have now.
For the new one.
Yes.
Now, many of the other buildings and names that you would recognize rather immediately, for example, the Lamer Hotel.
The Lamer Hotel. It is funny when people talk to me about the buildings, I refer to them by these names from the 30s, and sometimes they know them, sometimes they don't. The Lamer Hotel is Emprise Bank. It is the bank across the street from the library here that's 6 stories tall and has the restaurant on top and everything. The Strand Theater is vacant right now, but it's been restored and is really pretty. But people remember that as the Village Shop if you're of a certain age, and maybe the Goodwill store if you're much newer here.
Also, that Lamer Hotel had a not only cafe, which is still in existence, but also the drugstore that was a part of it too.
Well, the whole bottom floor had businesses. In fact, at one point, the Chamber of Commerce in the 30s is located there. That's where their offices were. And there was a jewelry store, and there was the cafe that was actually part of the Lamer Cafe, and several other businesses off and on. The Bissing dry cleaning group was there for a while.
And that's also referenced with a couple of pictures in the book.
Well, and behind what now is the parking lot, there was a service station that is no longer visible at all, but there are pictures of it in there somewhere.
And one other building that was a very important part of the early community of Hayes in the 30s, where a $100,000 grant was given by the federal government for a new federal building, which became
The post office.
the Hayes Post Office.
And we actually have the entire, he took pictures every day of it being built. So there's pictures of them digging out the foundation, just structure all the way up. So that's kind of a nice set.
We also had reference to O'Laughlin Motors, but there was also a Twinter Motors. This was the Ford dealership,
They were big competitors.
as obviously you might know, because the Chevrolet dealer was O'Laughlin Motors.
Yeah.
Knepp Super Service opened a grand opening in 1931.
And that building is still here. It looks slightly different, but it's the service station that's just across cat-a-corner from the library here.
And of course, there's still Oldham Sales,
Yes.
the original building there. Obviously, you can't let a presentation like this go without locating some of the, First Presbyterian Church.
Now the Historical Society down the street.
And Philip Hardware, which has been beautifully restored
It
as
has
well.
been restored, but it's been Philip Hardware since the 1890s.
And there was
Until
also
now.
St. Michael's Episcopal Church.
Now a lot of people may not remember it because it burned down, and but it's where the bank on the other side of the library is located.
Some of the references still to the Hayes City Flour Mill.
And it was very nicely painted at those times.
And of course, right next to the railroad tracks, obviously. You mentioned the Strand Theater. So many of those early buildings. Now,
You
when
can
we
still
talk
see-
about working, that's the segment 7 of the piece. Farming, of course, was part of it, but there was also other areas like implement dealers, support of the Civilian Conservation
Fishing
Corps.
Yeah, we had a CCC camp here. They built several dams on Big Creek. They built the swinging bridge and had a lot of different projects. That was one of the projects that Roosevelt put in during the 30s.
We should mention a lot of others too: Home Furniture, LK Dairy, Duck Walls, J.C. Penney, and of course Wiesner's. Many of these areas are depicted in the book. It's just an amazing look back at the history, and so well done.
I had a book signing shortly after it came out, and a woman came and said I wasn't going to buy the book, but then there was a picture of my uncle's chick hatchery pictures in there. And so I had to buy it, and so she came, and I thought, well, at least there was a reason.
An awful lot of names, too, that are still known and have been signified by buildings. For example, Fort Hays State, there was Worcester, there was Start, there was Albertson, and so many others.
Well, and we actually have pictures of Worcester teaching, and so that's kind of interesting, and Albertson teaching as well.
The director of the Hayes Public Library, Eric Norris, has called this a showpiece and a lot
that's
of
very
hard
nice.
work, in a quote from Eric. So this is something, as we said, that if you have relatives, if you have people who have lived in Hayes for a long time or had lived in Hayes during this period, maybe moved away, or had connections to Ellis County and Hayes, Hayes, the 30s, is not to be missed. A beautiful work, Marion.
And you can get it in several locations. We do sell it
Tell us.
upstairs. Our friends of the library bookstore does carry it, but Hastings has it. The Ellis County Historical Society has some. I think the Fort may still have a few. So, and you can get it from Amazon and places like that.
And it is fascinating. You talk about books that are written that can't be put down. Believe me, this is one of them.
Well,
Once you
thank you.
start, you will want to read it cover to cover.
Well, that's always nice to hear.
Mary Ann Thompson, the retired director of the Kansas Room and author of Hayes, the 30s, our community connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for watching.
Every Sunday afternoon, NFL Red Zone takes you from game to game, live in HD. Every touchdown from every game. Go to NFL.com/RedZoneTV. Get in the zone. NFL Red Zone.
Every touchdown, every game, every Sunday afternoon. Get the NFL Red Zone for only $29.95 for this year's season. Call Eagle Communications at 877-61-EAGLE.
Welcome back to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks again to our producer, Jeff Durall. We're at the Hayes Public Library and still in the Kansas Room as we meet the new Kansas Room librarian, Lucia Flaim, or Lucy as she likes to be known.
Yes.
Lucy, give us the background of your work as the Kansas Room librarian. What's your background?
Well, I finished my master's in library science this past December and began looking for jobs in Missouri, where I'm originally from. And though I went on numerous interviews, I was unsuccessful, so I ended up sending my resume to the Hayes Public Library. There were no open positions at the time, but I was very intrigued with the library. I had been on the website and was very impressed, and I had read that it was one of the best libraries of this size in the nation. A week later, I got an email from the director saying that they had just had their Kansas Room librarian resign, and the day after her resignation, they received my resume, and would I like to come in and talk about the job? And I said yes, and so I came in, and the meeting turned into an interview, and the interview turned into a job offer, and here I am.
Now, what about family?
My family lives in Missouri. However, I am in a relationship with a man who lives here in Hayes.
Your background in history, then, library science as such?
My background as an undergraduate was in communication with an emphasis in rhetoric, so I know a lot about symbolism. And then I pursued my master's in library science after completing an internship at the Harry Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. Fell in love with the work there in the archives and decided to go into library science.
I'm sure you're well aware that the Hayes Public Library is one of the most utilized libraries, not only in the state of Kansas, but in the nation, Lucy.
Oh yes, I have read about the rankings and the usefulness of the library, and it's just phenomenal.
What about your interests in the way of outside the library?
Outside of the library, my favorite things to do are, I love hiking and I love to be outdoors. And of course, Kansas has many opportunities for that. It's really an outdoors state. I also love to read. I think most librarians you'll meet will say that they love to read, and I really do. I also love to do projects like painting and collages and things like that.
I'm sure you've noticed too in the Kansas Room, not only Kansas history, but as we talked with Mary Ann Thompson, the former director, that there are a lot of Midwest histories and relationships, such as the state of Missouri, for example. Good representation in the stacks.
Yes, a lot on the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was integral in Missouri. Also, all of the trailheads that run through Kansas started in Independence, where I was working at the Harry Truman Library, so I do have some background in that also.
And the books that you're interested in, when you have a little downtime that you can read, what do you read?
I love to read memoirs and biographies, historical nonfiction, and I like to read contemporary novels as well.
When you wander through the stacks here at the Kansas Room, Lucy, what are your impressions?
It's pretty overwhelming. It's a lot to take in, and every day I find something new. It's like a treasure hunt, and I love that about this job. I love working in things that are archival or historical, because you never know what you're going to find and what that's going to mean to the people who walk through the doors.
Your future plans for the Kansas Room, what's on the docket? Anything particular that we should be aware of?
Well, we'd like to maintain and grow the collection that we have, so we're always accepting donations of books that people might have from their personal libraries or if someone passes on. One thing I'd really like to expand is the Walker Army Air Force base materials, because there really isn't a whole lot in this room about that right now. And I'd like to have more information on the city of Victoria. There's such a rich history there, and it's really important to the history of Ellis County, and I'd like to have more information on that available in the Kansas Room.
We have folks who have had ties in the past to the Walker Air Force Base, also to the city of Victoria. So hopefully you'll get some input from some people who may have some
Absolutely.
Archival information there. And the Future plans then will include those particular areas here at the Kansas
As
Room.
far as the collection goes, I also have some ideas for programming, but those are in the works right now, and there will be more to come on that.
Well, be sure and let us know in the media about those special
Oh, I
programs
will.
that will be coming as well. The Kansas Room Librarian, Lucia or Lucy Flaim, our guest today on Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks to producer Jeff Durall, and thanks for watching Community Connection on Eagle Community Television.
Thank you.